our Thunderdome this month, The World of Ice and Fire, which came out in 2014 and is the lore book, the world book for the Song of Ice and Fire series. Did The World of Ice and Fire add anything substantial at all to our experience as fans, to the canon, or is it just sort of a cash grab, a cash in on the series? I know some of us feel pretty strongly about that. Among us here, who all has read it cover to cover? Because I know that's actually not most people. Since it's a coffee table book, it's easy to read parts. So who all here has sort of read it, or have you just read snippets of it? Where do you stand?
I read all the words. I looked at all the pictures. I put it on a table. I had coffee while reading it. I did everything it asked me to do.
I've just read snippets of it. I've read a lot of it, but certainly not sitting down, and starting at the beginning and then going to the end.
My car broke down when I went to go get it, so there's that.
Wow.
Likely story.
That was a yes, you have read it, or a...
I couldn't tell you how much I have and I haven't read from it, because, I sat down and I looked at all the pretty pictures inside, and a couple of the chapters and perused it.
Right, okay.
But I normally only pick it up to, if I'm reading the main series and there's something that I'm kind of interested in, I will look it up on the wiki, and then if I'm more interested, then I'll go to the World of Ice and Fire and I'll read up more on it. But I've never really sat down and read it section to section, page to page sort of thing.
There are definitely parts of it that I sat down and read, starting at the beginning and went, and I really liked it, like the Targaryen kings. I read all of those sections as if it were a little history book, but anything on Essos or the Greyjoys?
See, I'm like Sam. I sat down and read it cover to cover. In fact, I had pre-ordered it to get it the day it came out, and the shipment got delayed. And so my girlfriend at the time went to Barnes & Noble and bought me a copy that day. She was like, I know you're just going to be intolerable until you get your hands on a copy of the book and sit down and read it. And she was right. And so I sat down and read it cover to cover, the day of the whole thing.
The whole thing?
Wow.
What were you thinking?
Well, I guess that's a whole other conversation. I was going to say, not necessarily what were you thinking, but there's so much there. It's like sitting down to read an encyclopedia, which is the point of it. It's supposed to be that. But what did you take away from it? Do you remember?
Mostly what stuck with me was the Essos stuff and maybe Tourney of Harrenhal stuff. I basically forgot everything about every Targaryen king as soon as I read it. I actually fell asleep reading the Vale of Arryn section.
How are the Arryns so boring?
It's true for the main series. It's true for the book. But anyway, so coming back to our main question. Where does everyone fall on this? I'm curious to see. Sam, what about you?
I've many a very structured thought on the failings of the World of Ice and Fire. And I think a lot of it comes down to its nature as a world book in the first place. I've bought lots of world books because I've read plenty of fantasy, and any pretty successful series gets one. The History of Middle-earth ones by Chris Tolkien are amazing. They're fantastic. They're well worth the money. The Wheel of Time world book is so terrible that fans literally all call it the Big White Book of Bad Art. And it absolutely deserves it. The funny thing, when I first got that book, it was delivered to my house because I got it through the internet. And my dog at the time, it was very crazy, Dachshund, not the calm Dachshund I have now. She attacked the package and she managed to rip it open and she tore off a chunk of the cover. And I think it was some sort of warning.
She was trying to protect you.
No such dog did it for George's world book. But my problem with these world books, when the History of Middle-earth came out a long time after The Lord of the Rings had come out, and Chris had hand-edited it and everything for that. But The World of Ice and Fire and the Wheel book and a lot of other fantasy lore books, they come out while the series is still ongoing. Yeah. Which kind of inevitably, there's going to be a re-release of it with added information after the series comes out.
Right.
So it's asking all the super fans, buy this now, and we know that you're such a big fan of the series, you're going to buy it again later. Which I don't really like because you're getting less of the information, surely, because he hasn't finished the series and surely he's going to come up with more lore and things to add. But you like the series so much, you're going to buy them twice anyway. And then the fact that so much lore has to be produced for it in the first place means that George created such a pool of lore to draw from that inevitably he's going to want to dive into that in the future books in Winds, where Feast and Dance had already gotten many a complaint for... diving into the lore too much already.
True.
Maybe a little bit.
Well, if he's done the world book by now, wouldn't he have kind of gotten a lot of that stuff out of the way where he didn't feel like with these travelogues that he needed to go back and tell the story of what happened, and now he can move on to his other stuff? Or is he going to double dip and repeat the story again?
That's a very good question.
I think I just contradicted my own my own point.
It is a good question. It is. Yeah.
I don't know what he's going to do.
Yeah. I always come back to, in Game of Thrones, that chapter where Cat travels to King's Landing and it's covered in like 3 pages, the journey, and then we get right into the story. That blew my mind, coming off, huge fantasy tomes where travels were the thing. I was so impressed with George. And then in later books, he starts, and it's all like the demon roads and all this stuff. It's very interesting, but he's flipped it around and he's putting the lore before like the story, before the plots and the arcs. And I feel like the more lore he makes, for whatever reason, the more he's understandably going to be tempted to do that. Sure,
right. Like the more that's in his head.
I wonder if, as he writes Winds of Winter and Dreams of Spring, if he, like, he's created this lore now, does he feel sort of hemmed in by that? Like, would he go in a different direction? But, he can't, because he's already published this world book that says X when he was thinking about
that makes
Y.
me think of how, like, he hadn't developed the Blackfires by the time of the Game of Thrones and the Hedge Knight and all that, and you can really see it. And then he comes up with the idea and it fits in really well. But if, like, before he started Dunk and Egg, he, sorted out all the history and then he realized, this could have worked better, but I've locked myself in. I never thought of that with a world book, but that's a very astute point. He might have, made so much lore, but he wasn't coming at it from an angle of how it would be useful to the story of A Song of Ice and Fire. That might be a point. Yeah.
Right.
Well, I guess my take on it is that I'm happy we have the World of Ice and Fire, just because it seemed like what was happening was that George was sitting down to write this stuff for himself anyway, for whatever reason. I don't know if he had the World of Ice and Fire sort of in his mind and was like, oh yeah, I should get that down, or if he was literally just brain dumping and then went, I could publish this. But it seemed like he was working on a lot of this material already, especially the Targaryen stuff, obviously, for the future book Fire and Blood, or the Gurmarillion. So it seems like if he was going to have this material exist for himself anyway, maybe it makes sense then to say, okay, well, the heck with it. Let's just add some more words to it, publish it as a world book, and we'll see what happens 10 years down the line, which is where we'll probably be.
From what it sounds like, he seemed to have written through it pretty quickly for the stuff that he was supposed to add to it, and like it just flowed from his head, like how some days George says he has really great writing days and some days they're really bad. And so I felt like this was like just a consistent group of really great days of writing.
We can't discount that Elio and Linda, they're co-authors of the book, and so certainly they did a ton of work on it. It's massive contributors, so can't put it all on George's plate.
Yeah, that's true.
That kind of ties into the app that they run. The point of the availability of the information interests me, because I know the app is paid, so fans are already paying. You pay for the info packs.
Yeah, right.
There's free stuff in the default. But a lot of information initially was coming into that wasn't in the books. And so then the world book was, you go and you spend the amount of money for a lovely coffee table book on this, and you get that. But it makes me think some fans, just want to use the wiki or apps or whatnot.
Yeah.
Paywalling feels like the wrong term, because it's like buying a book is not a weird thing. Like, we all know how to do that. But it does feel like kind of sequestering the lore to an extent that I don't know how much every fan is willing to go and buy a book they're probably never going to read cover to cover.
Sure, right. I mean, I was saying, that was why I wanted to get it the day of. I was like, I gotta know all these factoids that are going to be in the book.
And before it came out, there was hope that there was going to be, some sort of revelations or something. And yeah, you can say that there's a couple things like that, but what ultimately we got was just world building or lore building. It wasn't anything that proved one thing or disproved another
thing.
For
the mods that know a lot more about Harrenhal, how thin or thick was the information the world book presented on that in your view?
Well, if there was... Glad you asked. Now, if there was one section that I personally think was most interesting, it would be the bits about the tourney at Harrenhal, only because it adds the whole narrative of how it came about. it's couched in rumors and like, oh, we don't know this for sure, and this was the rumor at the time. But I don't know, you can kind of take it as this is what happened. We're just pretending for the story's sake that we don't know this.
Right.
The little bits that we know about Harrenhal were definitely bolstered by
I think
book.
It's the World Book where we get all the stuff about, not all the stuff, but most of the stuff about like the Wents being the financial like the financial dealings in the background. I think that was all the World Book, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
It was. Yeah, there was none of that in the main books.
I think most people, like, as anti as I am the World Book, I'll definitely concede that the art is magnificent. It's a beautiful book in itself.
Yes.
It justifies its like owning it. You know, it justifies its existence on that alone, I think. Just having this awesome art folio. Go ahead. No.
I was just going to say something I love about the art in the World Book is how the women are drawn. They look like actual real people instead of like that typical fantasy genre woman that seems to be.
I think we know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the art itself is gorgeous in there, but that was one thing that I that stuck out to me.
I know there are 2 art books, I believe, predating the World Book that a lot of the art was drawn from the role-playing games.
Oh.
I've never been able to get my hands on them because there's not many copies, and in Australian eBay they sell for more than I'd like. But it'd be interesting to see the art in them at some time and how it's stacked up to the World of Ice and Fire, where George had such a firm focus on hiring excellent artists to do excellent work.
From what I remember, I've looked at the. You're talking about like the tabletop role playing game.
Yeah,
books,
there's like separate art books that are just like compendiums of on the cards and stuff with some new things.
Mm-hmm.
But the role playing books in themselves look interesting, even if you're not playing the game, because of the added lore. They were kind of like a proto version of the World Book, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say I've looked through the big tabletop role playing one that they'd come out with, and there's some like extra lore things in there, world buildy things, but mostly very dry stuff. Very like how the Maesters are organized, that kind of thing. Which you'd have to be like 7 years deep into the wait for the next book to be really interested in that.
So what you're saying is it's like an expanded version
it's the next...
of The Princess and the Queen. I think there's some merit, though, to like having a giant world book like that. When I first started watching the series, because I watched the first couple seasons before I had ever read the books, immediately, as soon as I watched the first episode, I was like, there is so much history behind this. I'm not sure if I'm actually going to like this show based on just like Ned and Robert sitting down, because I don't understand what they're talking about in the past. And so it's kind of nice to have just something like that to set it in stone as its own thing, even if it's not particularly interesting to pick up and read.
I think
you're saying like maybe, I mean, I don't know, maybe just the fact that the series has gotten even so big lately kind of demands the need for just this book that exists that you can buy that has all that info that you need, all that backstory info that's relevant.
When you say set in stone, Aaron, I think that's really key because it calls to mind for me, like the show has its own kind of world books. I forget what they're called. I've got the first 2 seasons one. They're like a nice black hardcover book, and then it's got family trees and that. But what I really dislike about those is they're not set in stone. It's not a continuity that the show's slaving itself to, because you've got stuff like inconsistent Greyjoy family trees as the show has hummed and hawed over which brothers they might include in later seasons, which is, I understand it from a TV production perspective, but the like lore is naturally in limbo for the show, which is not as appealing for a fan like you, I'd assume, who wants to have a proper look at the lore and the history and kind of ground themselves, not be in this kind of flux where they're not sure whether the lore they're reading is going to be the lore the show's using in a year.
I think when I first started watching the series, what I would like to have had was a friend.
Oh.
I mean, a friend... I meant like a friend to sit down, like, here's what you need to know so you're not completely lost. Sure. Okay, there's this war that happened beforehand, and that I guess this would be getting back into like my Robert's Rebellion deal, whatever, like where it should be made as a prequel. But like, it would have been nice to have had an overview of this section of history. I don't know about so much the the older Targaryen stuff and how relevant that is to the story, but there are certain elements that they keep bringing up that it's nice to have something more concrete. But like you're saying, because the series isn't finished and George has yet to give all of his revelations for that, we don't really know entirely what happened during some of those events, because the Maesters are just kind of like, well, then this stuff happens and everybody knows what happened there, so I guess we're just not going to write it.
Yeah, right.
Like, that's what they say exactly about the Tower of Joy in the book. It's like, everybody knows what happened at the Tower of Joy. Moving on.
Yeah. Or the ink was spilled on the page.
Yep.
There was something about Summerhall, the prophecy, and there's just words that are left over from
Gildane's
the ink
account
that
of it,
spilled.
yeah.
It's those points where I feel inclined to roll my
Yes.
eyes and think I'm going to be buying this book again in 10 years when they unspill the ink. Or I say 10 years.
Yeah.
15, 20, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what do you do with a book like this in that period of time? Like, are they going to just go back and refill the book in, or is there going to be like a second book? Like,
I think they set themselves up for it well, because the whole conceit is that it's a Maester who wrote this contemporary account. So, in terms of the conceit of the book, you could say, okay, look, another Maester came along 15 years later, figured all the rest of this stuff out, and wrote the rest down.
Well, so it was Maester Yandel who wrote the World of Ice and Fire, and then it was the Gladden who was the other source whose notes have been mysteriously lost. So my guess would be that those notes turn up, and now we've got the rest of the information.
well, how do you combine those two? Do you recover all the stuff that Yandel covered in that, or you just include it from the perspective of Gildane or whatever? It's George's writing the rest of the story. Do you just cover it from that perspective? Like, how do you reference the other work inside of it? Like, here, you have to go and have this as well. The structure's a little strange.
I think Elio and Linda are very much skilled enough and passionate enough that they'd be more than happy to do a new kind of reframing of it from the Maester's perspective. True. I think they'd jump at the opportunity. I'd be happy to see what they'd do in that instance.
Also, fun tidbit, Maester Yandel is E-Yandel, like E and L, Elio and Linda. It's this
kind of nuance that keeps us returning.
That is a fun tidbit.
Yeah, so everyone knows. Yeah, I mean, I thought part of the conceit for this thing is that Gildane's account is going to be the Fire and Blood book. Like,
that's sort of what my assumption was, too, when I was reading it as well.
Which suggests that, like, basically the only thing that we're going to get really expanded on in the Fire and Blood Master World Book thing that's going to come out eventually is Targaryen dynasty information, and not necessarily Essos or Ashai or Karth, which isn't even mentioned in the World Book, I think.
Yeah.
Or it gets like a paragraph.
I like that the fact that a world book is like doing a sequel hook for another world book.
We gotta get the prequel to it.
Oh yeah, we should get like
this.
Yandel's rough draft where he gets everything wrong.
His pitch letter to his publishers.
Oh,
there was a time traveling fetus.
Are there any paintings of him as he writes we could try to decode?
There is also another aspect to the World Book, and that's when the World Book came out in 2014.
Yep.
14.
This would be about the time where Game of Thrones was definitely a successful TV series. And if you were looking to eventually do a prequel spin-off successor series, it would do well that you could pitch it to HBO in the context of, here is the huge universe that I have created and all these other possible stories that you could have.
That is interesting. The idea that the World of Ice and Fire is George sort of getting it out there ahead of the train.
That's the only part of it where I consider it to be some element of a cash grab. Like, it's more of a business decision than a cash grab. But it's hard to imagine from a perspective of looking for the series to go into a prequel series without having the context of the World Book existing now to lay that landscape. And like, George can also pitch like, hey, HBO, here are the number of millions of copies that I sold, so you can probably get X number of people viewing your series. I don't know if those numbers would actually be accurate, though.
On that kind of note of synergy with the show, I thought it was handled pretty well by the publishers that the book is called The World of Ice and Fire, and then the subtitle is The Untold History of Westeros and The Game of Thrones. that it gets the Game of Thrones on the cover, but it's not in like a sticker saying from the hit series from HBO.
Yeah, right.
It's a nice. It works in the lore.
That's a good point. Yeah,
that's just the kind of care that George has for the series, and it's one reason we all respect him so much.
Yeah, and I mean, I think in general, I would say this world book beats out most others just in terms of how high quality it is. I mean, debates on a lot of aspects of it are perfectly true, but like the art is great, the care put into it is awesome.
It's no big red book of bad art, that is for sure.
No dog's gonna eat this one.
I accidentally put one of my copies of World of Ice and Fire through the laundry.
What?
You can believe that.
Wow.
So what's our conclusion for the Thunderdome this time?
I feel like the World of Ice and Fire did add to the canon, and I wouldn't call it a cash grab, at least not nearly as much as something like The Wit and Wisdom of Tyrion Lannister, which is, minimum effort, maximum payout, right? Like very low effort. Mm-hmm. But I feel like it's something George wanted to do, and so ultimately it's hard to call it a cash grab because he wanted to grab it. It was a George grab.
As part of the opinion of the pro, I will say it was there was definitely a lot of love put into this book, a lot of care, a lot of want, and it didn't seem to take too much away from the rest of the series, should hopefully add to it and set the stage for some smoother travelogues and better understanding for the people who really are interested in this stuff. There you go.
As someone with my feet firmly in the anti-camp, I will say that a lot of good points were made on the physical qualities of the book, the art, and all that sort of thing, which did persuade me to concede my stance a tiny bit. And also the judgment of my dog assisted in that as well. So I'm anti, but less anti than I was.
Well, there we go.
Yeah, I think I'm somewhere closer to Sam on the spectrum, but definitely not nearly as far over there. I don't know that the book added a whole lot to the canon, but for people who like to dive into, the writing the theories and creating content, I think it was really useful in that sense.
Yeah.
Like, I know I've referenced World of Ice and Fire tons of times, but it's not something that I can see recommending to someone who's not quite as obsessive as someone like me might be.
Yeah.
So I think that's why I come down closer to anti, but by no means do I dislike the book. I love it.
Yeah.
I bought it 3 times.